Hello, welcome back. I'm Catzilla and this is where I talk about horror and all things horrifying to save my friends from my constant info dumping. So remember that one watch equals one free friend, okay? Happy late Halloween! You may have noticed that I've had radically different hair in every video for the last month. I've had pink, then green, then brown, and now it's blonde and short. And the answer as to why is that my self-esteem has been very bad. But I think I like this the best. I think this is the moment. So this should be my default form for a while. Do you guys like it? Today I am here to posit to you a question. And that question is, what does a sweet Dolly Parton starring musical comedy and a movie about Nazi orgy experimentation have in common? Well, it's that if you were selling either one of these in a video store in Thatcher's Britain in the 70s and 80s, you would have been in big trouble for either. Yes, today I'm talking about the video nasty controversy, craze, moral panic from the late 70s in the UK, where the government pretty much declared war on horror and set out to vanquish all movies they deemed too disturbing for the British public to see. Conservative activist and very prominent video nasty hater Mary Whitehouse does in fact see you every time you click on a disturbing movie iceberg video, and she rolls in her grave. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Somebody said, after reading one of your books, I feel like bludgeoning someone to death. What would you do?
I'd say, did you feel the same after reading Winnie the Pooh? Because it's every bit as likely. I don't think for a moment that the bludgeoning response is more likely to come from a piece of my fiction than it is from Winnie the Pooh.
Clive Barker, thank you very much for being open to question.
Thank you.
Now, the whole video nasty controversy really could have only come about precisely when and where it did. We have the whole Parents Music Resource Center panic in the USA in the mid-80s, founded by Tipper Gore, with parents concerned heavy metal music was harmful for their children and making them go off the rails. Hence why we now have parental advisory stickers on albums. That type of music was really popping off in America at the time, with bands like Metallica and Motley Crue forming and skyrocketing to fame, so yeah, makes sense. The same could be said for comic books in the 1950s and the mass panic around them being too violent and poisoning children's minds. Again, that period saw a massive boom in comics popularity, so naturally there'd be plenty of old naysayers. Now, you may be thinking, horror movies were a seriously booming business way before the early 80s, and you would absolutely be right. I think pretty much every decade has its own little horror mania in its own right. You've got the Universal monster, classic gothic, James Whale stuff that took off in the 30s and 40s with like Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, The Old Dark House. Those did super well between the two world wars as they resonated with audiences to kind of like work the trauma of all that out. Then you've got the Hammer horror and the wacky weird science stuff, mad cackling scientists and extraterrestrial monsters of the 50s and 60s. Again, very much reflecting societal preoccupations with the advancing of science and government conspiracies and such at the time. Leading up to and around the time that the video nasty term was coined, slasher was very much becoming the new greatest, biggest thing in horror. Slasher films are horror films more or less rooted in human evil as opposed to like ghosts and ghouls. It's pretty much focused on the pain humans inflict on one another, usually having one kind of deranged killer picking off all the members of a group. The main gag, the main appeal of these movies is seeing as many different creative kills as possible. Showing off some good old-fashioned practical gore effects and some final girl screams. They're often also pretty sexualized. It's very commonplace for this genre, even more than just horror in general, which is saying something, to feature lots of hot babes with their boobs out, getting the worst of the killing, suffering the most violent stuff in the movie, usually while putting their all into, as I said, very over-the-top screaming. A really common trope as well is people getting killed while having sex or about to have sex. on the one hand, could be because sex is such an intimate, like vulnerable kind of process, so it's automatically the most inconvenient and scary time for an axe murderer to walk in. And on the other hand, more scope for boobs. Slashers focus on the taboo, the gory, the gritty, and yes, the horny. They appeal to one's baser natures, if you will. Many cite Mario Bava's 1971 Bay of Blood as the first real slasher, and I would agree with that. It's very atmospheric, very drama-soaked little flick about a wealthy heiress that dies, and the all-out crazed bloodbath that ensues as all her loved ones go nuts trying to snag the most inheritance, inherit as much of her land as possible. Following that though, you've got all sorts of iconic slashers coming out over the 70s, like John Carpenter's Halloween and Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, just the rise of this especially violent flavor of horror alone already had a few squares and oldies displeased. I'm sure being a big horror fan at literally any point, like pre-1980s, would be enough for Chad to come walk over and give you a wedgie and call you a freak. But it wouldn't start growing into a full-blown moral panic until the home video started becoming really popular as a medium right at the end of the 70s, around 1979. It was then that VHS players were being sold in most high street shops, and owning or renting movies on video, watching them whenever you want at home as opposed to catching it in the cinema, had become a part of life in the UK. I say in the UK specifically because being a movie enjoyer was a pretty different experience here than it was in the USA, for example, at this point, because over there people could already access things like cable TV and stuff. Before this point, all the slasher haters and general violence on TV haters could find solace in the fact that to be shown in UK cinemas, these horror films had to be certified by the BBFC, the British Board of Film Certification. And usually they'd be pretty heavily cut in the process, especially under the watchful eye of the BBFC's head secretary at the time, James Furman. Furman's a kind of weird figure because those who were staunchly pro-censorship, anti-explicit content in films often speared him for being too lenient, cutting too little and age-rating movies too low. Like, for example, ever letting David Cronenberg's dark erotic thriller about vehicular crash fetishists go to screen, or giving Spielberg's brutal war film Saving Private Ryan a 15 age rating. He himself was a director, and he often spoke about how that gave him a more like empathetic perspective when censoring these movies and made him, you know, like want to be a bit more liberal with it. But as a general rule, I think it's pretty clear to see this guy was extremely conservative about the films he was cutting, especially when it came to horror films. Furman famously was super finicky about any display of weapons on film screens and how they were shown in movies, especially nunchucks, because they were legal in the UK at the time. So he was pretty convinced that all the little evil British kids that watched like one split second of it in a movie were gonna run out and start killing each other, you know. When it came to videos, however, the BBFC didn't really have anything in place for controlling their contents because those films were not technically being shown on cinema screens. In fact, many of them had never been shown in cinema screens in the UK, or at least had never been shown in their full uncut glory. Then you pair that with the fact that video rental shops were kind of the Wild West and that anyone at all of any age could get whatever films they wanted there. If fully grown adults bought the tapes, there was scope for their kids to watch them because it was no longer a simple case of just not bringing them along to the cinema, you know? The movies were in the house and could be played whenever at will with no one there to enforce any rules. So for the first time ever, James Furman and the rest of the BBFC did not have a hope in hell of telling people, not even children, what they could and couldn't watch. A lot of the big mainstream film production companies were pretty hesitant to release their films on home video at the time. It was very much seen as like still a new scary thing, kind of a threat to the art of cinema, and posing possible copyright infringement issues with how easy it was to like record little bits of videos and replicate them. So the stuff you could actually buy on VHS in those early days was by and large very low budget indie horrors, finally seizing their one chance to be seen by the British public. Cheap, gory, grindhouse bloodbaths with uber niche exploitation flicks, many jumping on the trend of the super popular slasher trend, but also many taking that even further For example, women in prison movies, focused with much violence and sex on women in prison, and Nazi exploitation, focused on showing the mostly sexual crimes of Nazis with no holds barred. Roughies, basically hardcore porn with extra blood and guts and sadism thrown in, and hicksploitation, all about cartoonishly crazed hillbillies and country folk. These movies soared with this new medium. In fact, I think it was a kind of Ouroboros situation of like these salacious movies doing so well on VHS because there were no BBFC related hurdles, but also becoming more and more salacious because of that lack of hurdles. They could make major waves with audiences without having to have a big budget or a theatrical release that way. While TV had always been a way of upkeeping the status quo in the home, a way for the government to show exactly what they wanted people to see, not show them what they didn't want them to see, push home their core values and stuff, it was now becoming quite literally a symbol of the opposite. It was a portal to all things taboo, and the low budget exploitation horror directors of the world were cashing the fuck in. Now, where things got really insane was, as it often is, when the Tories got involved. Namely a conservative activist named Mary Whitehouse, who kind of embodied everyone's growing concern about easily accessible movie violence in one loud, grating voice. She was not only conservative in her politics, but she was staunchly evangelical Christian, and those two were very much one and the same when it came to her activism. For example, in the 50s, writing pamphlets on specifically how mothers could avoid their sons turning gay, and initiating private prosecutions against basically any books and news outlets that showed blasphemous or permissive content. She found a bestie for the restie in 1979 Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And her goal was quite literally, in her own words, to return the country back to Victorian values. She also came from a background of TV and film related bone picking, having been heavily involved in the Clean Up TV Act and then founding the National Viewers and Listeners Association. All good at telling off the BBC for too much sex and swearing, and as she'd call it, filth in their programs. She'd already caused quite a stir with her beef with the show Doctor Who, describing it as having some of the sickest and most horrific material seen on children's television. Yeah, she's talking about that Doctor Who. So naturally, low budget, sexed up slasher movies with titles like Zombie Flesh Eaters and The Gestapo's Last Orgy were always ripe to send Mary Whitehouse into full-blown nervous breakdown. It's rumoured that now notorious video nasties like Cannibal Holocausts producers actually sent fake letters complaining about their movie to her because they knew it would make her go nuts and that they could get a little bit of publicity from that. It is believed she actually came up with the term video nasty amidst her tireless crusading against them in the press, but I do think it is the right-wing newspaper outlet, the Daily Mail, to whom we owe most of the iconic quotes of this era. In general, the panic drummed up by Whitehouse got loads and loads and loads of media attention, but none with such gusto as the Daily Mail. Why sick videos must be banned. Ban video sadism now. And this sick filth. We must protect our children now. And the most fear-mongering of all, the rape of our children's minds. They all come from their headlines. As you can probably piece together from that, the main concern with people was children watching these nasties because of the lack of like enforceable age regulations with VHS and like because it was the most sensational route to take, if you will. The fear was that if kids were exposed to movies this violent and dark, they would start to emulate all the fucked up stuff they saw in it, or as again the heavily sensationalized media coverage was saying, would be actually possessed by it and have their mental health irreparably damaged from a mere few seconds. Daily Mail literally published some fuck-ass random made-up story about a boy turning evil from watching horror movies to just drive this home. And in perhaps my favourite little tidbit from this whole drama, Tory MP Graham Bright also told the press,
I believe that research is taking place and it will show that these films not only affect young people, but I believe they affect adults as well.
And my follow-up question for that is, what about cats? My cat has been acting real sick and twisted ever since I showed her Zombie 2. It's really interesting. I read the book Ghosted by Alice Vernon recently, which is like kind of a history deep dive on belief in ghosts, and kind of a little bit as well like belief in the supernatural, possessions, telekinesis, stuff like that. And she wrote in that about how there was this big boom and kind of panic about poltergeist activity around the late 70s and early 80s, so around this exact era. Like for example the Enfield haunting with the Hodgson family, you know, the one in The Conjuring. That's definitely exactly how it happened, guys. It was exactly like that film for sure. Only much research since then has picked out the pattern that most of these kids who are complaining about poltergeist activity targeting them were living in council houses during a period where Margaret Thatcher made massive cuts to council housing and in general made it her mission to make life pretty unlivable for poor people. Alice Vernon was talking in the book about how the absolutely shitty condition these houses were in and the way their residents were looked down upon contributed to the poltergeist scare, and these hauntings kind of became a way for these kids to like feel in control again and reassert their place in their home and their world. Or they were at least like a manifestation of that inner turmoil, depending on what you believe. And I think a lot of similarities between that and the video nasty panic can actually be mined there. Like, yes, people were wanting more and more dark and fucked up and bloody viewing material. And alongside that, there was an all-time high of delinquency, riots, mental health crises in young people. But while conservatives conflated the two, you know, they saw the latter as a product of the former, it was very obviously all actually caused by their own shitty government. Mass unemployment and poverty were the only real evils possessing young people here, you know? And yes, there were children out there reporting that they had seen certain video nasties, just as the Daily Mail feared so much. You can very much imagine how with all these like lewd, disturbing videos floating around and everyone talking about them, how it became quite a schoolyard hot topic. Similar to the way like kids in my generation, we would all boast about having seen beheadings on Live Leak the night before, or like read the most depraved creepypasta imaginable. Psychologist Dr. Guy Cumberbatch actually did some real research into this at the time though, where he asked primary school children for their thoughts, their letterbox reviews for real video nasties, and then some fake made up titles. And most of the children reported having seen and loved both the real and fake ones, meaning they likely hadn't seen any, and that the media coverage banging on about protecting them was probably just making them way more intrigued and excited about it all. And so this brings us to how the government tried to combat it all, how they stopped being keyboard warriors and actually got out there on the battlefield to slay video nasties once and for all. Their first effort was basically just heading out to as many video rental shops as they could and confiscating anything that looked scary, as in quite literally. The snatch squads or obscene publication squad were groups of policemen sent by their local governments to go and confiscate anything that they suspected was a nasty. Of course, you can see why issues were run into very quickly there. One man's nasty is another man's nice. And without sitting and watching every movie ever, it was hard for the police to ascertain which films they ought to confiscate at a glance. That's an important thing to note all the way through this, that pretty much everyone on the side of censorship, so Whitehouse, Margaret Thatcher, everyone had not actually seen any of these movies that they were so angry about. They had just like heard summaries and stuff. The closest they got was when the House of Commons was shown a kind of like best bits compilation video of all the like goriest, grossest bits of films like Evil Dead and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, just so they could get a grasp on how dire the nasty sitch was, which is just genuinely hysterical to imagine. So the snatch squads were really just left to base their decisions on like hearsay and on cover art and titles of movies. That is pretty much entirely how the Dolly Parton musical I mentioned at the start, Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, ended up getting swiftly snatched, because they saw the word whore and were like, whore. And with video nasties being such a talk of the town by this point, it was super commonplace for horror VHS covers to imply they were much, much gorier and scarier than they actually were, you know, as like a selling tactic. A pretty lukewarm slasher flick with a couple painfully fake looking stabbings could be roped in with the big, bad, mind-possessing Nazi exploitation ruffies of the world with a simple pair of bare breasts and some blood on the cover, and instantly become a smash hit with all of Britain's edgelord teens. And yes, I'm talking about you, Toolbox Murders 1978. This is a direct attack. Naturally, video store owners were pissed and deeply confused about what they should do. The Video Retailers Association had to like actually ask for some proper clarification and some solid guidelines on what they could and couldn't stock. The Director of Public Prosecutions kindly answered them with the legendary official Video Nasties list, which has since gone down in history. All the films that the government deemed categorically too disturbing were compiled into this list, which was split into different sections for different levels of disturbingness and also the corresponding different levels of trouble you'd be in for selling them. It really is the prehistoric disturbing movie iceberg, only with like legal consequences attached. Here, finally, we get to see for once and for all what counts as a nasty, what officially makes a film too scary, too gory. We're not just going by what Mary Whitehouse reckons or what some random kid on the playground is talking out of their ass about. We have it in writing. And the truth it reveals is that it's honestly still really unclear what the fuck is a nasty. So the bottom tier on the list is kind of the only one that people would refer to as actually the video nasties. That was this tier. And it was kind of considered like the lesser of evil. They were films that you wouldn't be in any serious legal trouble for getting caught with, but they could be liable for confiscation. So you probably wouldn't want to like display them loud and proud in Blockbuster. There is lots of very well-known films seen in this tier of the list. We've got household name slashers like Friday the 13th 1 and 2 about the masked serial killer Jason Voorhees mutilating teen summer campers, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre about a group of friends who run out of gas on a road trip and end up victim to a crazed family of cannibals. Several films by some of mine and the world's all-time favorite horror maestro directors got lumped in here, like David Cronenberg's exploding head movie Scanners and his psychosexual body horror take on zombies, Rabid, and then George Romero's more traditional and completely cinema-changing take on zombies, Night of the Living Dead. John Carpenter's The Thing, chock full of slimy, cosmic body horror as it follows a shape-shifting alien running through a group of researchers in the Arctic. Dario Argento's bordering on art house Suspiria about its underground coven of witches running a dance school. All of these films we now consider masterpieces were liable to be snapped by the police. The Exorcist 1973 was never officially on any lists, but James Furman, BBFC head who we met earlier, had an absolute personal vendetta against this movie and saw to it himself that it was never released on home video until he retired in 1999. He was literally so fucking scared of that film, he couldn't even get it on the list, but he just had to have it like out of his sight. So what I'm saying is, in this tier, you could be the most prestige, big name cinema project and still be classed as an official video nasty if you just showed a few too many people dying or fucking. That would totally null any artistic merit it might have had. That's not to say there weren't still a few good old classic B movies here. You've got the likes of Inseminoid and Extro, both are very disgusting and very genitally low budget alien horrors. You'll never guess what the alien does in Inseminoid. You'll never guess. There's some pretty nasty, roughy, adjacent kind of torture porn flicks laying around here too, like Wrong Way 1972, about a couple of girls whose car breaks down and are then gang raped by a bunch of crazy hippies. That's known as hippie-sploitation. You get it? And Schoolgirls in Chains 1973, about yep. So it's altogether pretty damn confusing what separates these films from like any of the movies in tier 1, for example, which I'll get to in a sec. Section 2 was pretty similar. These movies hadn't technically ever been successfully prosecuted for obscenity, but you could still be taken to court over distributing them. It would just be under a less obscene charge. And you could avoid any serious legal trouble if you just let the police take it away and were like, Yep, my bad. Again, there are some super iconic films here that are just really funny to think about the UK ever being this weird about. Like, for example, Possession, about a woman losing her marbles and having an affair with this little cosmic terror worm beast. And Inferno, a sort of follow-up to Suspiria, about the deaths that occur at an apartment once inhabited by the same ancient witches Suspiria's coven is based around. The Evil Dead is in this section, Sam Raimi's low-budget zombie demon masterpiece that really is just chock full of fantastic practical gore. That was a record holder for amount of fake blood used at the time, with its whopping 300 gallons. There's definitely less of the prestige movies here, as you'd expect. We're getting into more classic schlock territory. And I don't mean to demean these movies even. Like, I heart schlock. Trashy Italian slasher flicks like Lucio Fulci's The Beyond and Giulio Baruti's Killer Nun, for example. Both so creative and so gross and strange. Butcher Baker Nightmare Maker is one of my favorite films. I am absolutely freaking insane and sick and twisted about it. It's the deeply queer and camp, incestuous, murderous boy mum movie that is on here. That is in tier 2. There are a lot of the scary foreign tribe movies popping up here. Cannibal Terror 1980, Man from Deep River 1982, and Slave of the Cannibal God 1978. They all follow characters in distant foreign countries stumbling upon vicious hordes of cannibals who torture and eat them for the runtime. Section 1 films were deemed the worst of the worst. Anyone distributing these would be met with hefty fines, their license revoked, and potentially, well, could well be jail time as well. Many of these are actually still banned in the UK. Obviously nowadays you can still watch them pretty easy even though they're banned here, but they've never been re-released in this country, or at least not uncut. Now, this section is completely dominated by rape revenge movies, and those are movies where for the first half of the runtime women will be brutally assaulted on screen, and then the latter half of the movie that same woman will go out and torture and murder the rapists in the most obscene, graphic ways possible. It's easy to see why they're hitting that extremely controversial sweet spot of sex and gore. It's one thing to depict a guy dissecting women and playing with their guts, and it's another thing to depict them doing so with a fucking rock hard boner. I Spit on Your Grave 1974 was listed, what with its full 30 minutes of horrific gang rape centric footage. The very similar Last House on the Left 1972 and Axe 1974, where the victim and subsequent revenge seeker is an axe-wielding 13-year-old girl. Of course though, it gets much more controversial than sex. There's a lot of movies here that make those look like Goosebumps episodes. Well, okay, not really, but Fight for Your Life 1977 is a blaxploitation movie where a gang of convicts launch a hideous racist attack on a black minister and his family. Slurs abound, humiliation, rape, nothing is off limits here. There is a scene where a small child is beaten with a brick. It's just insane. Section 1 also has a shocking amount of Nazi exploitation movies, as in it's shocking that so many of these are made. Honestly, just seeing Nazi imagery, even just seeing the font they'd use for their propaganda and manifestos and stuff, gives me this instant off-put reaction. And I'm sure just these titles alone will also make you violently uncomfortable. The Gestapo's Last Orgy, Love Camp 7, SS Experiment Camp, all of those are about horribly real scenarios of Jewish women being assaulted by concentration camp officers, displayed in the most salacious and insensitive ways possible. The Beast in Heat 1977 changes it up a little in that it's a female SS officer who has created this crazy man-beast creature and keeps him locked away in her castle. But then it goes right back into familiar territory as the beast is used to rape and torture more concentration camp prisoners. Plenty more racist cannibal movies here too. Cannibal Ferox, Devil Hunter, and the infamous Cannibal Holocaust. And then loads of straight up good old fashioned slashers, one of which being Bay of Blood, the OG slasher I mentioned earlier. Any movies here that seem a little suspiciously tamer than the others, that seem like they should maybe be a tier or two lower, usually earn their place because of the old crazy cover art problem. Like, for example, Abel Ferrara's Driller Killer, which I unironically love this insane cover. It is so hideous. And The Cannibal Man, which is really more of a dramatic political statement piece about living in the deeply oppressive Francoist Spain. There's actually no cannibalism in it even. Or if not misleading cover art, it would usually be animal violence. Lots of movies like Cannibal Holocaust and Faces of Death would indeed harm animals during filming and use footage of that. And low budget splatterfests like Blood Rights 1968 would actually use animal remains and innards and stuff as a substitute for gore. Practical effects got a little too practical, you know. To state the obvious, the authorities were never going to be able to seize all of these films and destroy them, never going to be able to stop the youths of Britain seeing them if they really wanted to. In a lot of ways, just having a publicly accessible handy list of all the films the government specifically didn't want you to see was actually very counterproductive to that. From all the things I've read from people who were alive during this and remember it well, I've gathered that like under the table sales became just a really big thing. You know, it was all about whose older brother's friend's cousin's dog had a copy of Blood Feast and could lend it to you for cheap. The only thing that really put the panic to bed was the Video Recordings Act, a law that got passed in 1984 that basically made sure these nasties weren't getting released to home video in the first place. It greatly tightened up the process of being certified, or well, created the process of being certified. VHS wasn't just a free-for-all anymore. The BBFC requirements they had to meet in order to be released were actually much stricter than the ones that were always there for theatrical release. Films could be denied certification if they showed excessive human sexual activity or acts of force or restraint associated with such activity, mutilation or torture of humans or animals, human genital organs or urinary or excretory functions, or techniques likely to be useful in the perpetration of criminal acts or illicit activity. After that, there was much less sobbing and crying from conservatives in the press. I suppose they felt like they had a bit more control over it all, and they had some proper legal ammo against the big, scary video nasty monster. And as you'll be able to guess from just how many really big horror movies were on that list, many of them have been released as things have gotten more chill over time, or released uncut, although, as I mentioned, a pretty shocking amount of them have never been. Little things like James Furman finally retiring from his role as head of the BBFC at the end of the 90s also contributed to it becoming much freer for horror movies to exist. The board always kind of molds a little to reflect the head's stance on things. And so that is pretty much it. That is a brief history overview of the video nasty situation in the UK. I think it's actually really important to look back on as a horror fan. You know, it reminds us of like a very slippery slope involved in saying like, this film is too much, it's too gross, and it shouldn't be made. Like, how that can only ever plummet into just full-blown censorship. If you are an enlightened and intelligent individual who's already subscribed to me, then you may think that sounds a little bit hypocritical. I love to complain about movies. I'm the first guy to say when I think something is just kind of racist or misogynistic slop without any true like love or thought for the genre put in, you know, no true artistry. And I really do think a lot of those like SS sex camp women in chains dying 1,000 deaths while fully naked movies are deeply off-putting. I do not want to watch them. They just make me feel bad inside. That is the one thing in this entire universe me and Mary Whitehouse have ever agreed about. Where I don't agree though is that violence and sex are inherently bad to show in film. Duh, my favorite director is David Cronenberg. I'm a big Henenlotter head. And I also don't agree with just banning the stuff I don't like. I think putting up with some stuff I hate being made and put out there is a fine price to pay for the sake of filmmakers in general to freely create, and for the things I love to keep getting made. There's no way to lay down blanket bans without so much of the stuff I do love suffering. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about this. So watch that documentary on Prime, Ban the Sadist videos. That was really helpful in forming a lot of this, and also just scratched my little brain real good. I find it fascinating. And until the next video, what have you guys been watching? What have you been reading? Recently just watched The Long Walk again, and I made my girlfriend watch it without warning them at all just how sad that movie is, and they cried so hard. And I also watched Terrified, or Aterrados, for the first time, and that was a very fun, spooky little movie that held my attention really well. You should go check it out. It's definitely a Halloweeny vibe. As for what I've been reading, I'm reading All Hallows by Christopher Golden, and I must say I'm absolutely hating it. It is a slog, man. But I also think I did it dirty by reading it just right after I finished The Exorcist, which was incredible. Bye!